I will talk a bit about fantasy story for a minute. And this is what's really interesting to me. I actually am a huge fan of fantasy. I've been a fan of fantasy since I was a little tiny kid. I read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings when I was like in 3rd grade. The fantasy is just a big thing for me. But what I've been personally a little bit saddened by is the way in which we've sort of shut our minds down about fantasy and decided that this is this and this is that. Like, we've created this fantasy now almost exists as a historical thing because people have such an expectation about what their fantasy should or shouldn't be. The perfect example is dwarves, right? If you put a dwarf in a game, okay, it's going to have a Scottish accent. Like, everyone knows exactly what, you know what a dwarf is. It's going to be a little short guy. He's going to have a beard. He likes to drink beer. He carries a hammer. He carries an axe. He's got a Scottish accent, and he doesn't like elves. And somehow we've decided that that's the only thing that can exist. And there's, when you think about fantasy, there's a million ways you could go with fantasy. Just the idea of a dwarf having to be exactly like that because that's what dwarves are. It's really fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me that we've shut our minds in fantasy so hard, so fast that we know exactly what everything is. We know orcs don't like elves. But it's fantasy. We could make a world where elves don't even exist, or orcs don't exist, or dwarves don't exist, or a world in which the dwarves and the orcs are like the best friends, or a world that has none of those things but has a little short guy with big teeth and warts. And there's a million things we can do with fantasy, but somewhere along the way, we have just sort of, as a society, decided it's almost like commedia dell'arte. I don't know if anyone ever studied that. I was a theater guy when I was in high school, and we had to study this sort of thing. The idea that there were certain set roles and characters in the old commedia dell'arte. There were like 12 characters, and every theater group had to have these 12 characters. They had the old man, they had the lovers, they had the old woman, they had the capitano, which was the military figure, they had Dr. Graziano, who was the doctor, and every comedy troupe had this, and they would write all of these plays where every role could be played by one of these people. There was always a Dr. Graziano role. There was always a role for the two lovers. They even had names, right? And in this world, like, it was, I mean, to be blunt, it was designed for a low education audience. It was designed for people who needed to have those tropes, sort of made for them because they didn't have the intellectual ability to understand a whole new story and a whole new group of characters for every play that they watched. And also they'd have the time. These were, for whatever reason, it sort of coalesced into that. And I feel like fantasy's done the same thing. I feel like fantasy has gone into this world where it's very difficult to write fantasy where you say, like, you know what, in my world, wyverns are kind of wimpy. In my world, wyverns die easy. They're about the size of a large Doberman, and you can barely get the damn thing in the air. Like, I could write that fantasy. We could make that fantasy about wyverns. But because there's sort of a shared human knowledge about what a wyvern is, we kind of can't do that. And it's funny that we would limit ourselves so greatly in fantasy, of all things. I mean, that's the whole point of fantasy, is to dream of a world that doesn't, exist. That's the whole point.